Welcome back to another explainer. So today we're stepping into an absolute historical pressure cooker, the late Joseon dynasty in Korea. Picture this, you've got ancient, deeply rooted traditions suddenly colliding head-on with rapid, intense Western encroachment. It was a time of massive anxiety, totally upending the status quo and leaving people desperately searching for their identity in all the chaos. And out of this crucible, two profoundly brilliant but radically different philosophical movements emerged, offering completely distinct blueprints for the future. Today we're unpacking this ultimate clash of ideas by comparing the autogenous modernity of Donghak and Daesoon thought.
Which brings us to a really monumental question, the very heart of our explainer today. How exactly does a nation modernize without losing its soul? Just think about it for a second. When you're faced with overwhelming foreign influence, you essentially have a stark choice. Do you just throw in the towel, copy the foreign powers, and abandon your heritage? Or do you forge your own indigenous path, modernizing strictly on your own terms? Well, both Donghak and Daesoon absolutely chose that second option. But as you'll see, the methods they used to get there couldn't have been more different.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. Two paths to modernity, 2. Heaven and earth relations, 3. Perspectives on the West, 4. Views on Japan, and finally, number 5, the legacies of indigenous modernity. Let's dive in.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Two Paths to Modernity. We need to clearly define the core concepts that anchor this whole discussion.
So, the absolute crucial concept here is autogenous modernity. What does that actually mean? Basically, it's the process of a culture modernizing independently. Instead of just copy-pasting Western systems over their society, both Donghak and Daesoon were striving for a completely self-generated modernization rooted deeply in their own Eastern philosophical traditions. They both desperately wanted this autogenous modernity, but man, they took vastly different forks in the road to get there.
And the comparison here perfectly illustrates our ideological boxing match. In one corner, we have Donghak's principle of Dogi Jongjeon. This is all about preserving the energy of the Tao so that absolutely nothing evil can enter. It is fundamentally a resistant modernity, literally opposing force with force. Donghak acts like a giant, impenetrable shield against foreign invasion. But then, in the other corner, we have Daesoon's principle of Songsang. This is all about coexistence, harmonious creation, and explicitly not repaying evil with evil. So where Donghak acts as a shield of resistance, Daesoon offers this wide-open door of inclusivity and harmony.
Moving right along to Section 2, Heaven and Earth Relations. Let's see how these fundamental differences actually shape their views of the universe itself. Okay, so Donghak pursued modernity by trying to reach way beyond the traditional Neo-Confucian worldview. They reinterpreted the concept of ghosts or spirits not just as some natural yin-yang effect, but as a literal transcendental heaven. They believed the universe was created through what they called the vaporization effect. Think of it as the universe expanding and creating from this incredibly vital energy. Their focus was heavily placed on maintaining absolute, unwavering sincerity to this solitary, transcendent force. It's a fascinating, deeply self-sustaining worldview, though it's worth noting the sources point out it had some limitations in totally breaking free from traditional boundaries, mostly because it didn't fully accept a personal deity or a divine name, keeping it as this somewhat solitary, resistant cosmic force.
Daesoon, on the flip side, completely contrasts with Donghak here. Instead of a solitary, distant heaven, Daesoon actively incorporates divine beings into a highly interactive theology, forming a literal structural triangle. Picture this. You've got the ultimate being in the 9 heavens at the very top, then the divine beings, and then humans down below, all constantly communicating and interacting with one another. It's a very active structural order where harmony between heaven and earth is established precisely through these divine interactions.
So when we stack the two up against each other, the difference in how humans are supposed to relate to the cosmos is like night and day. Donghak emphasizes sincerity to a transcendent heaven, full stop. But Daesoon expands this into 3 core virtues: sincerity, respect, and trust, collectively known as Songyang-shin. For Daesoon, sincerity is the creative pathway that actually connects heaven and humans. Respect represents showing proper courtesy to heaven and earth. And trust? Well, that's the very foundation of how heaven and earth operate in the first place. Daesoon uses these 3 virtues to actively repay and harmonize with heaven and earth, setting up this deeply cooperative, rather than isolated, universal order.
All right, Section 3, Perspectives on the West.
Let's take a look at how these two philosophies reacted to the absolute biggest catalyst for modernization at the time.
The divergence here is just incredibly striking. Donghak took a deeply, fiercely confrontational attitude. In fact, the very name Donghak, which translates to Eastern learning, was coined specifically in direct opposition to Seohak, or Western learning. They literally centered their entire identity on boundaries and opposition. Daesun, conversely, chose an amazingly inclusive worldview. The term Daesun itself emphasizes the concept of a great circulation, or total inclusiveness. Rather than fighting the West tooth and nail, Daesun pursued a win-win relationship. They were actively seeking harmony between East and West through the ancient principles of yin and yang finally coming together.
Just listen to this quote from Daesun Thought. Eastern Jewish saints say Donghak, Western Jewish saints say Sohak. That perfectly captures Daesun's remarkable inclusivity, doesn't it? They didn't just quietly tolerate the West, they actively found ways to integrate it into a much larger cosmic balance. Our sources even note that Daesun evaluated Western figures, like the Jesuit missionary Matteo Rucci, incredibly positively. They actually praised him as a figure who brought heavenly civilization down to Earth. That is a massive, massive paradigm shift away from Donghak's strict policy of resistance.
Which brings us to Section 4, Views on Japan. Let's dive into the battleground where these differing philosophies clash the most dramatically.
Donghak's resistant modernity is probably most visible in its sheer, unadulterated hostility toward Japan, utilizing some incredibly harsh language. A quote here, "A Japanese enemy like a dog." Wow. But this perfectly aligns with their core principle of opposing force with force, right? They were wary, they were highly combative, and they believed deeply in strict exclusion to preserve their own identity.
But then Daesun offers this radical, almost whiplash-inducing pivot. Quote, "Japanese people are Japanese, so treat them kindly." It's just wild to see that contrast. Instead of exclusion and hostility, Daesun actively promoted peaceful coexistence, even with their historic adversaries. They argued that conflict, fundamentally, had to be resolved into coexistence. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some pragmatic political stance. It was a deeply theological one, based on a concept that is the absolute lifeblood of their worldview.
And that crucial concept is Heiwan. Heiwan literally means resolving historical grievances and turning deeply rooted conflict into harmonious coexistence, or sangsang. For Daesun, resolving the lingering, incredibly bitter grievances from historic tragedies, tracing all the way back to the devastating Imjin War with Japan, was absolutely paramount. According to their theology, this resolution of grievances with Japan was literally the very first step required to reconstruct the entire world order. The logic is simple but profound. You absolutely cannot have harmony without first resolving the deepest grudges.
Now for Section 5, Legacies of Indigenous Modernity. Let's wrap this all up by looking at what these diverging paths actually mean for the history of East Asian thought.
So let's walk through this summary, clearly laying out the final results of our ideological boxing match side by side. For Donghak, their modernity type was fundamentally resistant. Their core principle was exclusion, pushing out the foreign to rigorously protect the native. The dynamic they relied on was clashing, meeting force with force. Now on the flip side, Daesun's modernity type was entirely inclusive. Their core principle was resolution, specifically Heiwan and Songsang, resolving those deep grievances so everyone can live together. And their operating dynamic was harmony, finding that yin-yang balance in a rapidly, chaotically changing world.
Together, these two approaches give us a complete, totally fascinating picture of Korea's autogenous modernity. So, what's the ultimate takeaway here? Well, first off, both philosophies successfully redefined heaven-earth relations entirely on their own terms. That alone proves that East Asia had its own vibrant, independent paths to modernization that didn't just rely on mimicking the West. Furthermore, they offer us entirely new paradigms for how cultures can actually interact. We don't just have to either assimilate entirely or go to war. There are rich, complex philosophical frameworks for either fiercely guarding one's heritage or actively harmonizing different global civilizations.
Which brings us right to the present moment. Think about the intense cultural clashes, the rapid technological changes, and the heavy geopolitical tensions we're all facing today. As you look at these two 19th century Korean philosophies, I really want to leave you with this final thought. In today's highly complex, completely globalized world, which approach do you think is more vital? Do we need a shield of resistance to protect our core identities, or an open door of inclusion to find some kind of harmony in the chaos? It's a profound question, and one that these brilliant historical minds are clearly still helping us answer today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.